Everyone talks about AI, everyone talks about, IT and automation. Relationships are fundamental to business. When you were 20 years old, you were driven no matter what, you were going to be successful, you were going to win.
That are listening, give us your backstory. How'd you get into technology? Tell us about your first sale and, really what you're doing now.
So we started out providing IT services. We started providing training. We started providing reselling some products as a bar, and then providing support on the products that we resold.
What do you look for in people?
You kind of understand the nuance of the value chain. You understand what customers want.
Welcome to Built to Scale with Anthony Mongeluzo, and I'm your host, Anthony Mongeluzo, and I'm here with a longtime friend, business innovator, entrepreneur, board member, and you name it, Mel Baiada. So Mel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully. Thank you for having me here today.
So Mel, I first met you through the Tech Leaders, which I think we're celebrating our 18th year, 17, 18?
Yeah, probably, because I think it was probably 2008 or so, 2007 or 8. Yeah, so it's been a while.
So, and I remember when Mel came into the room, if you're in the IT world, Mel is a legend and, just done a lot of fantastic things. So as a really young entrepreneur, it was exciting for me just to have the opportunity to talk to Mel and get to know Mel. So Mel, for people that are listening, give us your backstory. How'd you get into technology? Tell us about your first sale and, really what you're doing now.
Sure. I think in the greater Philadelphia area, I guess I have a little bit of notoriety. So I grew up in southern New Jersey and went to a couple different schools, went to Drexel University and worked for a few companies. RCA, which was now part of Lockheed Martin in Morristown, New Jersey, which is part of the government systems group. Worked at a company, ADP Brokerage Services, and then worked for a company selling data communications equipment. And I went to that company because I wanted to get more exposure to the sales process. Previously I was more in systems engineering kind of things. My background, my undergraduate degrees are in engineering, electrical engineering. So I wanted to be closer to the client, understand the sales process. And I basically always had this vision that I would start a business because growing up, my father, had a business, my uncles had businesses, my neighbors had businesses, and then my older brother had a business. So I kind of figured that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to basically start a business. And I always was interested in creating things and doing things. So after working for a few companies, I said, all right, where's their market? And what
age was this, by the way?
So I actually was on the 6-year plan for college. So I took a little bit longer to get through college. So I worked for a couple companies for about 6 years, those companies. And then I started my company, Bluestone Consulting, when I was 30 years old.
Okay, so young.
Yeah. And I had saved up like $20,000. Our first child was born in September, and I started the company that year. But it was somewhat straightforward because I was doing a little bit of consulting for my brother's company called BAYADA Home Healthcare now, but it was really to provide IT services. So while he was successful in providing nurses and aides in the home healthcare space, I figured, I could just do the same thing in the IT space. And that was because that was the late 80s. So that was prior to outsourcing to other countries for coding. So it made it much easier to go to the DuPonts of the world and the Wall Street, New York City firms and provide IT services to them on a consulting basis. So I basically my background was technology, but I was not a very good programmer. But I really was kind of understood the market. So what I did early on was I read incessantly, not just business books, but really kind of trade rags. Like, where's the market going? What's happening in the market? And I remember saying, everyone was moving off of the mainframes. So I basically said, all right, Unix is a good niche. And Unix workstations, they were running, applications in the Unix environment. So I basically positioned myself as the Unix experts. And I really didn't know much about Unix, but I kind of positioned
Unix is
myself
tough.
as an IT, services firm focused in Unix. So my first client actually was DuPont, and they were moving off of the mainframe environment. They had a special group trying to understand how they would do that. So I was persistent in getting in the door to a DuPont, group, and after that, started generating some consulting revenue. After that, kind of went to Wall Street, started providing all kinds of different services from system administration to programmers, and then eventually started reselling some software products in kind of the niche, Unix space. So it was a really listening to the market and doing sales. That was
Now,
really...
what did you scale to in terms of team members before the exit?
So, we had grown really well, and I basically focused on just reaching out to companies and prospects and hired a sales team, and also really kind of built a sales engine. And I was driven to succeed. So we started out providing IT services. We started providing training. We started reselling some products as a bar, and then providing support on the products that we resold. So we had grown in these different business units, and I put someone in charge of each one of those business units. And so from the late 80s to 95 or so, we raised some venture money in 95, split the company into multiple companies, Bluestone Software and Bluestone Consulting, because we built some of our own software products. And then the software company, actually, we went public and I got acquired by HP in the 2000 timeframe. So at the time of acquisition, I think the software company was around 500 people or so. And then the IT services firm was around 300 or so people. I'm doing that from memory, but I think that's basically the side.
I know what it takes to have around 250. So, and if you're dealing with all the VCs and all the other people, I'm sure that had to be some interesting days.
Yeah, I think I was really focused and driven to succeed and win. And one thing I noticed post, exits, I was successful, came into some money, and I wasn't as driven to win as much as do interesting things that I felt were interesting. And that was a mistake, because it's easy to get enamored with an idea or something you find interesting, but there's not a market. And I try to do things to help the ecosystem in the greater Philadelphia area, New Jersey, head of the New Jersey, I was the chair of the New Jersey Tech Council for a while, but I wasn't as driven to win because I had, money in the bank and had some assets, and didn't feel like I had to keep on building that kind of net wealth up. So, and that has its pros and cons. That has its pros and cons.
Well, I'll tell you one, and you and I kind of talked about this once. I'm not sure if you recall, but I've experienced it. PCS has grown, been fortunate with, good media exposure and just, a lot of success. But the problem is, I also think when you do something successful once, it's like, oh, well, I'm Midas. Like anything I do is going to work. And then, you know what? You realize you're not Midas, you're human. At least that's what's happened to me with some, different investments and different things.
Yeah, you get a little arrogant in some respects, not consciously obnoxious, but you kind of have this belief that, all right, well, I was successful in this one domain. I'll probably be just as successful in another domain. And the challenge with that thought is, in the domain you're successful at, you kind of understand the nuance of the value chain. You understand what customers want and how to provide them good service and how to provide them, with real value. When you go into another domain, you don't have that just intuitive feel and just knowledge of that value chain. And you're counting on others maybe to do that kind of problem solving and figuring it out. And typically doesn't work the same way. Yeah. So I agree.
So the interesting thing, and I want to talk about, some different ventures you're involved with now. Obviously, Cordial just had a successful exit. For me, when I invest in other companies, people, I have 12, 13 LLCs, and people are like, oh, how do you do it? Your phone must be ringing off the hook. And it's like, no, I've invested in really good people. People didn't bring me in. I always joke around when we signed the deal. I go, listen, I'm not signing up for another job. I'm signing to be an investor. I'm a bat phone here. I'll jump in your board meetings. But, I already have a job, right? I'm the CEO here, which is enough work. So as you're getting into these ventures, what do you look for in people? What are you willing to commit? And I'm sure each deal and each thing's a little separate. And maybe, one or two that you're having a little fun with right now.
When I first had some financial success from the Bluestone in the 2000 timeframe, I invested probably in like 20 plus companies. And there were kind of more passive investments. And, I got my money back and made a little bit, but I wouldn't say I had any kind of super home runs back then. And I basically felt that passive investments were good from a diversification point of view, but I kind of wanted to find companies that I would have a little bit more influence and a little bit more role, because I didn't have a day-to-day kind of operational job like you do. So I started to look for companies where I could have a little bit more say, or I wouldn't say, but I could add more value to. And you mentioned Cordell. So Cordell was one of those companies that, had, first ran into Alan probably in the 2005 timeframe, and then, eventually invested and, played a role in counseling, advising, prodding, whatever, supporting kind of to move the company forward. And so I found over the last, 10 to 15 years that more into, finding companies that I could have some role like that rather than just passive investments. And so, over the last few years, one of the companies that I've invested in, a company based in South Jersey called Senna Health. And Senna Health was started by a doc, Anthony Webby, who was formerly at Jefferson Health System. And he was focused initially on hospital at home, a very kind of critical patient, kind of in the home setting, with the belief that home is where individuals want to be, and it's less expensive for the health system to send individuals home and take care of them. But there's all kinds of challenges, predominantly with funding and payers, the payer mix for hospital at home. And he had these other business units, one focused on helping businesses, but also helping medical practices. And so I basically, pushing him to say, hey, focus on the medical practices and supporting the front end for medical practices, and build a sales team, build a sales engine. And so with that, they're going gangbusters, growing probably 300% this year. They're doing wonderfully. So how can you get involved in companies and share, some of your individual, scars and lessons learned that companies could, the importance of focus, and understanding, where the product market fit is, and basically the importance of building a sales engine. Yeah, it's critical. It's critical.
So one last question for you before we get into rapid fire. You said it a few times, and I'm sure people that are watching, listening, are going, yeah, I want to build a sales engine. I want to grow 300%. How do you teach these, doctors, right? There's no sales class in medical school, right? How are you teaching these folks to build the engine? And is there anything specific that you might say is common in sales engines across different industries? Like, obviously you need the verticals and different things that you do, but I'm sure there's some things that someone in any industry could look at this and say, this is what I need.
I think the CEO, the founder, the founding team has to do the sales initially to understand what it takes, who the ideal customer profile is, what moves them to close, what interests them. So too many times a founder will just hire somebody to run sales for them, and that person doesn't spend the time to really understand the customer's needs. So I think it's really, really important for the founder to be the salesperson, or the founding team to be the sales team initially, until you kind of understand that product market fit, until you understand the ideal customer profile, and until you understand the value proposition, how to deal with objections, like all the things, right? So once you kind of package that up, whether you write it in scripts or whatever, how you do it, it's all about how do you fill the top of the funnel. Now that you know who you're going after, all right, what's the sales funnel? What's the qualification hurdles? What's the, how do you move people through the funnel? How do you do demos, or how do you, whatever it is? And then what are the closing, what's the closing process? So once you kind of get that figured out, then you can start putting people into the mix, and hiring, right? I think you gave me a book maybe 5 or 10 years ago about the importance of sales management and sales operations.
Sales management simplified.
Yeah, exactly. And those concepts, right? They're really important. Yeah, so it takes a little bit of understanding and learning and discovery before you kind of put the engine in place.
Makes sense. Let's do a little rapid fire. Business hero. Who do you look up to? Who is past, present, or whoever? Business hero.
I don't know if there's any one person because you can learn from so many people, but I have to say, one of your other questions is who's been most influential, and it has to be my brother Mark, right? So my brother Mark is 11 years older than I am, and he started a company called BAYADA and Healthcare a number of years ago, and he's dogged, focused on purpose, mission, and vision, right? And core values. And he's stay on goal, stay on task, understand your why, and just keep on marching towards that and bringing, the good thing is home healthcare is a big market, and, there's challenges with payers and, hiring aides and nurses, and there's just a lot of operational challenges. But he's dogged in providing, amazing quality service for the clients and bringing people into the fold to help help millions of people worldwide. He's dogged on that. And it's all about relationships. It's not just relationships with the clients. It's also relationships with your team members. So, and that's something that's not going away. Everyone talks about AI. Everyone talks about, IT and automation. Relationships are fundamental to business. And, you're a relationship-based salesperson, yeah. Right? You kind of go out and you talk to people and you meet people, and it's about relationships, and that's not going away.
It is. We talk in meetings in here that with all the AI and self-healing and who knows what's coming, not knowing it, we knew live line was a good thing, right? Picking up the phone live, people still don't believe we do it. Call anytime we do 24/7. But that's going to be the differentiator because, again, it's the people.
It's the people.
So how about favorite book? Or how about this? We'll break this down to two. Your favorite book and the book that you think helped you the most in business.
I think the Jim Collins books have always been kind of a go-to for kind of most business people. Good to Great, Built to Last. That's,
Yep.
But one of the books I think is not really talked about, which is kind of interesting, and it's really about decision-making. Like all of the books on human nature and decision-making, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast, Slow. But one of the books is called Certain to Win, the strategies of John Boyd applied to business. And John Boyd came up with this concept called observe, orient, decide, and act. And it's really basically an OODA loop. It's an OODA loop, OODA, right? And it's really about the process of making decisions and getting feedback. And John Boyd worked at the Pentagon. He was a fighter, a pilot, airplane, aircraft fighter, but he took his lessons learned and applied it to business, and constantly getting feedback, challenging assumptions, gathering information, etc. Because business is nothing more than a group of people working together to achieve a goal, but also getting the feedback and constantly making decisions to move the ball forward, right? So whether it's systems thinking of how you do that, having a good mental model of how you do that, and just making good decisions. And that book, Certain to Win, kind of gives a mental model of how to go about that decision-making process, I think, yeah.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, one of the things I learned when I was younger, being the IT guy, I would get to meet all the different CEOs and, with the keys to the kingdom, as you know, right? You have admin access. And it was always about getting that feedback. Hey, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? We make happy calls, and it's a lame name, but we make happy calls every week to ask our customers, right? We're always doing smile back, whether it's happy, sad, like it's constant feedback. And, I used to hate meetings, but I realize how important they are. And, I've said it before on this, our operations meetings probably move the company here forward more. It's probably the best meeting because I'm not involved with it because I'm distracting in meetings. At least that's what they say, right, Veronica? So last one, what's a quote or a mantra that you live by?
It's funny. I don't know if it's any one thing because there's so many contexts for so many different ones, but it's a funny one because everything's hard till it's easy. And it's interesting. So when my daughter was in grade school, like up until fifth grade, she never really studied or did anything, right? She was just kind of smart. She paid attention to class. But then, it gets to a point where you got to start putting some time in. You got to look at the books. So you got to figure stuff out. And just randomly, I had gotten a fortune cookie that said, like right around that time, that said, everything's hard till it's easy. And I kind of just kept on saying that to her to make her realize, all right, things are hard. That's just the reality of life. And until you put the time in to figure it out, when it eventually starts to get easy. So yeah, so it's kind of a funny one that, when I saw your question or heard your question now, that it kind of popped in my head. Yeah, so.
That's pretty cool. So we're going to wrap things up, but what I always like to do, especially with successful folks like yourself, there's young entrepreneurs, right? There's aspiring business leaders, and they're saying, I want to be Mel Baiada, right? Everyone sees the success, right? They see, and also, of course, when they see the name, they think of your brother too, because he's done such a great job, with his business. But they're like, well, I don't have any money. You actually got through one of the hurdles. One of the stories I always like to share, I'm successful because I started my business when I was 20, had no kids, and was not married, right? I went the opposite way. I had my first child at early 30s, 33, because I needed to get this squared away and this out of the way. And I was laser focused. No one was going to stop me, right? And then obviously you have children priorities. You did it at 30 when you just had a baby and you had 20 grand. So there was no trust fund. It was 20 grand, a will to win. So for these folks that want to take it to the next step, what advice would you give them to get started, get moving?
Everyone says do something you're passionate about, but I think passion could also be a detriment because you're too emotional about it in some respects. I kind of like the word driven. So you were driven. When you were 20 years old, you were driven. No matter what, you were going to be successful. You were going to win. And I was that way when I was 30. And I started a services business because it didn't need a lot of capital. You started a service business because it didn't need a lot of capital, I'm sure. And so, but it's really competitive and it's hard. So how do you differentiate yourself? So it's about hustling. One of the things I think that's most entrepreneurs aren't doing these days is everyone wants to help other people, especially someone who's starting out. So if the entrepreneur, the 20-something goes and starts asking individuals for their help and feedback about the domain, the value chain, and say, hey, I'm just trying to learn this stuff so I can eventually maybe start a business. Too many people try to, there's forming, storming, norming, and performing, right?
Yep.
Most people go straight into trying to sell something, trying to go into, storming and forcing something down clients or a prospect's throat. So it's more go out and talk to people and say, hey, I'm just trying to learn. Can you help me out? And eventually you start to make relationships and contacts. You start basically learning the value chain. You're learning where the holes are, and whether it's building a product or a service, just go talk to people. I think it's so critical. You could read all the trade rags, which is wonderful because it gives you the context, or all the websites and all the blogs and everything else. But you just got to go out and start talking to people and asking for help. I think that makes a huge amount of difference.
I agree. I mean, and look, that's where it started for me with the tech leaders, right? When I was in the tech leaders, I was one of the younger guys. I probably had one of the smallest companies. And, you hear it too much, but it's intimidating. But I sent you an email. You took the time. And honestly, I think every time you make that contact, right, it's like, okay, well, if Mel's willing to meet with me, maybe this person will meet with me. Yeah, you'll get some no's along the way. But if someone's busy, guess what? You're still in the same spot with a no. So yeah, I think that's really great advice.
And actually, a quick no is better than a long maybe.
We said it all the time. You know what? Don't waste time. It's too precious. So speaking of which, we're at time here. So I want to thank my friend Mel. This was great, dropping some knowledge here, and I hope people truly appreciate who they're getting to hear from and really what you said, because this is a blueprint for success. So I hope you could tune in next time to Built to Scale with me, your host, Anthony Mongeluzo. And thanks so much for tuning in today.
Thanks for listening to Built to Scale with Anthony Mongeluzo. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next conversation on growth, leadership, and technology. And if you want to watch the full video version, head on over to our YouTube channel at Help Me PCS. The complete episode is waiting for you there. Until next time, keep building, keep scaling, and we'll see you in the next one.